Hi. So with that introduction given by Elizabeth, I'm just going to start at a very broad level, and then I apologetically promise screenshots of database interface at the end. So in the work that we do in museums specifically, as I'm speaking from, there's a conflict between the realm of, say, museums and archives in which, libraries and archives in which you want to describe and enable access to particular content. In museums, I'm finding more and more the complexity of the work that I'm coming up against is to also be creating through that metadata the story and evolution of those works, their interpretation as they persist within collections. So I'm looking to this quote by Lev Manovich in his 2002 work, The Language of New Media. A database can support narrative, but there is nothing in the logic of the medium which would foster its generation. And with apologies to Manovich in this, because as he works this dialectic between database and narrative out, there are some really beautifully worded sentences, and this one is one of the more blunt of them, but it really does distill as a good starting point, like where we're at. And as that conflict, if it can be spoken as between database and narrative, please don't strain your eyes to actually read. But in the realm of digital humanities, there have been efforts that sort of exchange critical analysis with computational observation or computational discovery, such as this, I think, 2011 project by the Stanford Literary Lab, which took the it did data ingesting from Victorian literature in order to scatter plot the most frequently used words. So trying to find pattern from narrative through the use of data analysis. And in the arts and in museums, we see efforts like the Google Cultural Institute's experiments, which any number of them, they identify machine learning, image similarity, serendipity, my personal favorite, as thematic technical approaches to playing with the data sets that are provided them by museums. Now, when looking at any of these sort of label copy or tombstone-driven projects, and I'll take, for example, the X degrees of separation, which enables users to seed an algorithm with two separate images of works from their combined databases of over 2,000 contributors, one at the left and one at the right, and it creates sort of a crossfade of image recognition between them, which delights. It's a very delightful experience to play with this experiment of theirs. If we peel back a little bit, you look at what it means to take this data, these data points, and to create if this could even be called a narrative, the objects themselves are mediated by the camera. The data set that they are provided is limited to the scope of the collections that participate, and as well, more and more we're seeing that with arts that are time-based, installation, performance-based, or even efforts to capture and engage audiences with indigenous knowledge systems and oral histories, we're leaving out so much of what is possible for engagement and even for that great experience of serendipitous discovery. We're also denying, I think, in these excerpts of data, the interpretation of exhibition histories that curators have placed upon their collections and the exchange of loans and exhibition history that really tell the stories and keep museum work relevant in engaging audiences. And efforts to take label copy data and share it in a linked environment are incredibly important, and they are happening. I would make an argument that a more complicated but also just as necessary concurrent effort would be exhibition histories, and I want to give a nod to Jonathan Lillet-MoMA, who is devising certain ways of linking those data sets. The artworks within collections, far be it among them, are becoming more complicated to catalog. We have instances of installations with live animals, or the sort of ineffable exchanges that Tina Segal orchestrates, or the galleries transformed into performance spaces and stages, like David Levine's work at the Brooklyn Museum in 2018. And also efforts to creatively imagine how oral histories are described, such as this image at the bottom right. from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. So this is an interplay of new media, experience, digitized, online accessible realms, but a lot of it has to do with how experiences are captured, how experiences are relayed. And that speaks to the explicitly technical as well. I mean, as MoMA is collecting video games, or as conservation efforts are made in earnest, as they have been in the past years at Guggenheim, to emulate outdated technologies to run internet art, such as this upper left-hand example of Mark Napier's Net Flag, or what to be done with extensive hours-long artist interviews with artists like Sarah Z, who have over, I think, 40+ projectors in this very difficult to discern faraway installation shot of her piece Timekeeper, in which each of the projectors have themselves been physically augmented, almost making each of them a component of a work that is itself so specific to that install that you wonder, when that projector gives out, how exactly is one meant to replace what is thought of as replaceable obsolescing hardware. So that brings me to the work that I've encountered at the Guggenheim, having arrived there only about 1.5 years ago, to back up a few steps, because when thinking of these more sort of future-forward, complex realms, it hadn't occurred to me necessarily that even if I could map the needs for information to be more expansive and more inclusive of oral traditions, or perhaps of even thoughts of post-relational database realms, that work would also be, that work that could be found in this category would be like conceptual artworks from the 60s or 70s. And that brings me to a trove of works, about 354 artworks that were acquired by the Guggenheim between the years of 1990 and 1992, that had come in bulk from Giuseppe Panza, who was a collector who collected very, very deeply in the late 50s through and onwards until his death in 2010. And the works that came into our collection were some examples of what he was installing in his own Varese villa, which is now open to the public as an exhibiting space. But not just within this sort of like Baroque villa environment. He had a stable in which he did much more in-depth and long-term installation of artists like Dan Flavin, Mark Rothko, James Turrell, and Robert Morris, and Donald Judd. In taking in these works, what was not necessarily discerned was the fact that a number of the works had been acquired by Panza as certificates describing works that had not yet been fabricated, had not yet been realized. And the artists were at the time alive, and he had great moments to consult. This is an example of 2 certificates of works that were never realized, that were nonetheless purchased by Panza, and Panza at Judd's studio just downtown here in 1975. And the assumption and the contracts therein were that the collector and the artist would work closely in the fabrication of works in the future as they needed to be realized. And after the acquisition of works by the Guggenheim in the early 90s, the discovery was that 25, which is about roughly 7% of the works in the collection, are contested and likely not viable. What does that end up meaning to a museum? What does that mean when you have a work that is not viable? What is its value, and what is its pertinence in this narrative that we're trying to forge out of the data that we're collecting about our collection? So I'll just use Judd as an example. I mean, the show just opened at MoMA. It's worth definitely visiting. And also, he is became one of the more vocal contesting artists within this collection. So in the course of the relationship between Judd and Panza, this is an exemplary moment of having the work that was acquired by Panza for this untitled raised top plywood piece. If you can even see, I don't know if even from far, but you can see that the work that was acquired by Panza on the left is a Judd fabrication. In the case of the work on the right, Panza had started lending out works and having them fabricated in Italy, in some cases not with any consultation with the artist. So in this case, the Guggenheim's acquisition actually is of the right-hand image. And you wonder, what does that mean for a work that over the course of time became one of the very hotly contested elements of Panza's persistent arguments with Judd's consistent arguments with Panza. Just a number of issues of correspondence between the two. Judd openly describing that he's dissatisfied with the fabrications, having discovered them only after they were exhibited. He even went as far as to take out an ad in Art in America in this bottom right corner here. He says, the fall 1989 show of sculpture at the Ace Gallery in Los Angeles exhibited an installation wrongly attributed to Donald Judd. He's like full on just removing himself from the credit of that work. And he went as far as in 1990, as maybe many of you probably know, publishing a piece in Kunst Intern called Una Stanza per Panza, in which he really rips into his feelings about what it means to be a living artist who's watching their own work be fabricated at a lesser quality than they would imagine it to be. So I introduce all of that to describe then the sort of flummoxing position of conservators and curators at the institution. And it began a series of applications and grants with the Mellon Foundation that lasted from 2010 until wrapping up this year. And it went in 3 phases. The Panza Collection initiative began with a massive, phases through each I guess the first and second phases each selected like 5 or 6 of the artists, particular artworks that really needed to have this kind of deep dive in which original correspondence, you could hear Panza is looking in earnest for advice on fabrication, to an inventory of the works that we have. These are the components of the piece in the previous slide in our storage space, to conservation assessments of those works, in which in this particular image excerpted from one of those, it's described that even the grain chosen by the fabricators is not representative of Judd's work generally. I mean, even if I were to back up to this slide, you can see there's a sort of like delightful marbleization of grain, and then there's a much more styrated there. And these seem like issues that of course do create the essence of the work, and you have in this golden opportunity a moment to really create contrast, to say that by learning what a work is not, you really learn the essence of what an artist's work is. And in the end, each of these works generated and I'll just reference Elizabeth's point earlier, a Word document of the history of that artwork. And they're incredibly rich. They have exhibition histories as well as accounts of correspondence regarding the works. And yet, what we're left with in our database, and this is an image from TMS, if any of you are familiar with that database, you'll recognize this. This is the component screen, like not even looking at the general objects record, but looking at our component element, you can maybe read that we have not only the component elements of the work, but we have historical armature. We have elements from a 1983 fabrication, a 2019 fabrication, a 2018 fabrication. And the general documentation around these are all under the umbrella of one single object record, which doesn't necessarily seem surprising if we're talking about an installation of any work that does, and as many works do, have either like exhibition copies or any other elements that would be considered specific to one install. But in this case, there's a lot more to it than that. And we have kept the elements that are no longer considered to be part of the actual artwork as it would be exhibited today, except for in the very valuable case of a didactic display, to show this history and to show the conflicts that have arisen between the collector and the artist. So in other instances within this collection, Lawrence Weiner, for example, you can see that the Panza Collection's work might seem in some cases to be fairly straightforward. Lawrence Weiner's work is all textural, and therefore we don't really track locations in our storage of the work, aside from its elements that are more of certificate basis. When it's lent out, it is site specific, and because the artist is alive, he can advise in that. However, there are elements of his work that you can see a definite amount of elasticity. So how the work is displayed can change quite drastically. Pardon me. And so really the work of the Panza Collection Initiative was to explore the elasticity of that work while artists that were in the collection are still alive, and to also review the places in which Panza really misstepped. This case with Bruce Naumann's Nuns Sing Neon Sign. On the left, we have a fabrication created by the collector, which completely misses mark in the most obvious way of the Guggenheim fabrication, which was made in concert with the artist's preferred fabricator and by advisement of his studio. The Panza Collection initiative created 3 instances of bringing together a group of the advisory committee members to explore installed side-by-side versions of works that had previously been installed, as well as the sort of supporting documentation, and creating and fostering discussion around what each of these artists possibly want to use the word, even though I think it sometimes falls short, as intent. Intent sort of denies the context and reception, and therefore the iterative aspect of a lot of the works involved. I mean, you can see in this right-hand image of the Lawrence Wiener's suite of installations, these are all very different textual outlays. And how then also furthermore to reconcile the installed piece, and this is an example of the work of Naumann's being installed in our storage spaces, specifically for that advisory committee access, and the documentation created for installation by our institution, and how that also sort of takes on the original sketch out of the work by the artist. So the relationship between all of this documentation and also all of the actual facts of installation and the history, those all sort of coalesce in these spaces, these opportunities for conversation, which culminated in April of last year with a symposium, and there will be a publication forthcoming this fall about the findings of this entire project and its research. As the collections information manager, I wonder how that becomes, more of a structured / unstructured data repository for those who would like to research and assess it in the future. While it's great to actually have the experience of seeing and investigating the armature of the contested Judd from its side, how do we actually get to the stories that were told, the conversations that were had that led to conclusions as to what is and what is not a Judd? In the course of this, we came up with a new category of artworks for our collection, a decommissioned category, which remain as accessioned works, but that the works that no longer were considered to be part of the collection outside of telling this exact narrative of this arc of discussion and argument between the collector and the artist. This category was established in June of 2016, and it refers to any work that for any reasons of authenticity or condition is deemed to be non-viable, yet being possessed of historical significance is preserved in whole or part. A work identified for decommission may be represented in the collection by components and or documents, as well as by extant manifestations of the work as object. The director, chief curator, and chief conservator, working with the foundation staff, will propose works of art to be decommissioned to the Art and Museum Committee of Board of Trustees. We get into a lot of procedural discussion about how this happens, but the fact is that we came across the first instances where we had to actually have those conversations and create procedure for how this happens, and therefore by acknowledging the value of these stories, it's almost a meta conservation of the intent of work rather than just its physicality. So now as those promised screenshots, what I came across as part of let me back up a moment, as part of the Mellon deliverables, of course the publication and having some kind of publicly accessible record of this project, absolutely necessary. What really broke through is I was trying to tweak our relational database to represent as best I could these processes. The idea of the object started to, and I think maybe people have come across this as well, but the object itself started to sort of just disintegrate. And the idea of an object was questionable, whereas the fact of an event became much more prescient. So in TMS, there is a module outside of the objects module, which is an events module. And I know that at the Whitney Fair, SWABA has been utilizing this events module, which is just a way of marking a space and time and attributing it to particular constituents within the collection and adding objects that relate to it. It's used, can be used for public programs. He's been using it for the documentation of performance art instances and events. I sort of tweaked that as a means of collecting oral history, and I do not expect a lot of like scrutiny of this. This is more just like a test case for best practice in the future, moving forward perhaps. But you can add all of the participants that then are co-located into these events of advisory committee meetings, specific in this case to Bruce Nauman and Lawrence Weiner, which were the images that we saw earlier. And you can attach all of the objects that were involved in that discussion, as well as any transcripts of discussion and or any further text that you would like. All of that then is searchable. Similarly, and even maybe for the specific artworks more import, doing that same thing when having interviews throughout this process with gallery, with like the fabricators and the folk that people were working with in the studio. You can do the same as to have the interviewees in the system, as well as the artworks that were discussed. And working, which is not photographed or not screenshot here, working with a series of attribute slides, attribute fields to describe what types of topics, and they're even to capture the shifting opinions that even Robert Morris had about his own work and what is supposed to be happening with the felt over time, et cetera. These are changing opinions, and if the main argument to be found is that it's hard in some cases to pin down the actual point of proper instance, you at least can say that what was fact was that it was disputed even by the artist in his own mind as his career progressed. In this case with these oral histories, one of the places that we've been able to link, it's like a forced interoperability with our archives. We put the link to the finding aid for any instances of these oral histories and interviews. It's just a way of sort of trying to create reference to other repositories within our institution. So I apologize for this being, and full transcripts also being put in the database for search and also reference. In this case behind, it's sort of, I should have done another slide on this, but like you can actually see too the transcript excerpts on particular topics such as plywood, I mentioned just earlier felt, instances where you could take a number of references to the same material, or even do full pages as we have done of the processes of use of felt in Morris's work. So really using this database as like a content management system beyond just being a collections management system. And after that deluge of screenshots, I'll just leave it with you guys. Thank you.